Hello, in this video, I want to continue the conversation that we've been having about abolition and the worker strike. I think that this is a really interesting conversation that's intimately tied to the question of like the worker strike and the resolution that's upcoming, because it like really pushes the question of like what is defined as worker and how we're able to like figure out really what the worker strike is defined as, what is it recognized as, and what role does the state kind of play within the worker strike. I think that is a really interesting way to think about the kind of like ties between private entities and governmentality and the ways in which passive forms of governance, such as like the recognition of worker strike, kind of allows for continued kind of like passivity by the government in the face of kind of like unfair conditions in the context of prisons, and the way in which the carceral system kind of serves as this kind of central network to continue various types of violence under capitalism that a worker strike would attempt to attend to. And I think that abolition has a lot of really interesting, diverse arguments to give out this for this resolution, and I definitely think it's something worth investing time into, whether you're planning on reading it or planning on figuring out a way to defend against it, because I definitely think either way it's important to kind of be knowledgeable and aware of really what's going on with the criticism and the ways that it can be relevant. If this is your first time kind of like hearing anybody talk about abolition in the context of the worker strike, I would definitely say go back and watch the intro to the worker strike video and the part one for the interest and the part one for the worker strike and abolition on the neg versus policy teams, because this video is going to be a direct continuation of that, where we're talking about how to read abolition as a negative strategy against policy teams as it relates to this more specific parts of the debate, like the link debate, the permutation debate, impact comparison, alternative debating. In the last video, we did a lot of kind of like top level framing and priority, kind of describing in order for us to figure out where we should be going with this criticism, and now we're kind of getting more into the nitty gritty portion of the debate that I think are really important to think about. I think that when you're considering, for instance, what you should be doing with the link debate in times like this, I definitely think that no matter where the affirmative is going, it's really important to like stand your link ground in terms of why you're able to define abolition as something that has to be against the defining of the worker strike movement, and why a worker strike movement has to be focused on something that is outside of the capability to really attend to the questions that like is raised in the context of prisons, the conditions that they're faced, and why they're not really thought of as workers. Because I think starting and continuing that kind of like central thesis point and that distinction between the worker strike and the movement for abolition is incredibly important, not only for building like strong offense, against the affirmative in general at like a just pure thesis level, but also making sure that you're stopping the affirmative from making like any type of like creative link-turn arguments down the line or permutation arguments down the line that subsume the alternative by like trying to expand the definition of how we think about worker strike, or by trying to like win that there's a spillover into the ways in which worker strike spills into prisons. And I think that kind of like dealing with that early on is incredibly important, no matter like what the affirmative is doing. I then think kind of like splitting it in the ways that we've been talking about, the stuff like, for instance, the kind of like conversations that we've been raising about the ways in which there are kind of different affirmatives that operate a little bit differently on this resolution. So there are some that I think will really go hard on why the worker strike is kind of good for being able to resolve capitalism and challenge like the ways in which like things like unfair working conditions and wage inequality and things like that are kind of resolved by the ability of worker strikes to be guided as a human right. And I think against those affirmatives, like I've said, I think it's incredibly important to kind of like use some of the arguments that are being used in a lot of other abolition arguments, where you're really focusing on forcing them to defend those movements and defend what those movements are able to do, i.e. winning that those movements are kind of like organized around principles that do not allow us to focus on prisoners, that don't put prisoners on the agenda, and make it so that the way in which people kind of protest radically in resistance to the government and their failure to recognize the way in which the carceral system becomes central to the ability to govern, as a kind of like means to basically move those movements and the state towards something that feels like innocence, and the ability to kind of like pathologize movements that are kind of like doing resistance in forms of thinking through the state otherly, which causes forms of like militaristic backlash. It causes things like police crackdown, etc. And I think there are a lot of interesting work to do there. While I also think that on the other side of things, when you go to a place like these hard right affirmatives, you have a lot of arguments to make about why the overfocus on the ability for a government to like show itself as benign and as moving towards reform and the kind of like or the kind of like removal or repairing of capitalism, basically, that kind of like framing for how we should think about like the ability for the government to model itself internationally is one that codes over the ability for the U.S. to continue to do various forms of like domesticized violence that go through other kind of like avenues besides the ways in which people are constituted through the workplace, and that allows the U.S. to separate itself from its ability to privilege how private companies not only become more influential on the international stage, but also how they're able to basically make back their revenue through other types of investments via things things like the prison. I think that this makes it a lot easier when you go to questions like the permutation, and you're easily able to refute why the basis for those things would be the same type of consumption that you're making on the link arguments, and use that as kind of the continuation that you need in order to apply the arguments from the framing of the thesis to kind of prove that the permutation is really a no-go from the jump, and that the alternative, even if it is able to win like a material basis for it, the things that it does, at a base value has to be a refusal of the affirmative in order to stop the possibility of being kind of consumed by the like violence that is produced under the ways in which like this state is able to think about like how these movements are co-opted and thought of. And I think that being able to add additional offense to that about how this has happened historically and really warranting it out could be a really good place for you to kind of like make the permutation like a no-go in pretty much all the debates that you're in against affirmatives that are just in the policy arena as a whole. I then think that when you go to the impact comparison debate, there's a lot of really interesting arguments to be made about why things like futurism and its relationship to the state and the state's ability to determine how the future is and to correct itself in the future eternally are things that are able to continue to produce the same relationship to time that makes carcerality so violent and makes it such a repetitive course of like basically time, because of the way it is able to continue basically the violence of the past via things like slavery, dispossession, and the kind of like inequality that is created under the conditions of work, and like basically accelerate them to the conditions of those that are like facing prison, and use it as a way to continue the lumpinization of like various types of populations, and using that as a reason why the continued like privileging of the affirmative's kind of epistemological bias for being able to like weigh their impacts in the first place is one that require an investment in those very same forms of violent futures. And I think that's a really interesting place for you to be able to like vary and diversify your offense up against a lot of the types of arguments that people will make about why things like utility and the ability to like weigh the consequences of like what capitalism or the end of democracy could bring to bear, and kind of flipping it against them, so that when you move to the alternative debate, a lot of the things that you're winning is not that we're not able to resolve for any form of material violence, but rather that the way in which the affirmative decides to organizing principles for how we resolve that violence is only able to be done by its like by its ability to kind of like separate itself from more radical forms of resistance, and to take the state out as a responsible factor for the continued lumpinization of various populations that makes like the violence of capitalism itself inevitable, and that causes basically the worst forms of impacts for why these things exist in the first place to continue and are outside the bounds of what is normally demanded from in terms of these worker strike movements. It makes it impossible for us to think about resistance that's made outside of those terms. And hopefully this video is really helpful in like making you think about like the various portions of the criticism and the ways in which they can be used against policy teams. And yeah, hopefully you'll keep tuning in for the future. Appreciate it.